Hey, old man, what are you standing here for? Think you're in charge? This is private property. Please move your vehicle. Don't tell me what to do, you hear me? You think that uniform makes you someone? I'm just doing my job. Job? You're a fossil. The officer shoves Carl hard. Carl takes a step back. Step away. What did you say? He swings and hits. You need to learn your place. February 2023. The small town of Halebrook, Ohio, lay frozen under a dense layer of gray snow and black ice. The streets were nearly deserted, with only the occasional pickup truck crawling over the icy asphalt. The air was sharp and metallic, the kind that bit into skin and left lungs aching. Every exhale turned to thick fog, drifting upward like smoke from a slow-burning fire. At the intersection near the old administrative building, its red brick facade crumbling in places, frost clinging to the windows, stood Carl Jefferson. 73 years old, former Navy SEAL. Now a security guard. He had the build of a man who had once carried weight that few others could, broad shoulders slightly hunched, hands thick with scar tissue and strength, eyes that still watched everything even when they pretended not to. His breath was steady, his posture unmoving, like a statue left behind after a forgotten war. Every morning he followed the same routine: unlock the gate, check the cameras, walk the perimeter, pour hot, bitter coffee from the dented metal thermos. He carried like a relic. He spoke to no one unless required. He nodded to passers-by without waiting for acknowledgement. This post wasn't about prestige. It was about presence. 5 years had passed since he left active service. He'd taken this job not out of need, but principle. It gave him a reason to move, to remain alert. He didn't expect recognition, and he didn't want it. Order was enough. The building he guarded wasn't high profile, some minor government annex used for regional processing, but Carl treated it like a command post. Snow collected in silent drifts against the fence. Lights buzzed faintly overhead. The world around him moved in slow motion, dulled by winter and silence that night. As dusk settled over the town and turned the snow into slate-colored shadow, he noticed the headlights before he heard the engine. A patrol cruiser rolled down the street too slowly, tires crunching softly over ice. Inside were 2 uniformed officers, young, full of energy and entitlement, faces glowing from the dashboard lights. The car stopped directly in front of the SEAS gate. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the passenger door opened, and one of them stepped out. Tall, lean, clean-shaven. He glanced around as if surveying a crime scene. His eyes locked onto Carl and lingered. There was no greeting, only appraisal. Hostile. Cold. Carl remained still, arms folded, expression unreadable. He followed standard. Procedure, gestured calmly to the posted signage that restricted unauthorized parking. He expected the officer to nod, maybe move on, but instead the other door opened. The second officer joined the first, broader, older, with a practiced smirk. That didn't reach his eyes. They approached. Not hurriedly, but with intention. Carl stood his ground. The younger one stepped closer, chest puffed out, fingers flexing at his sides. The older one barely glanced at Carl's ID badge. He didn't seem interested in explanations. Then it shifted. A sudden jab to the chest knocked Carl off balance. Another strike higher, his head jerked back, feet sliding on the ice. The fall was heavy, bone and muscle meeting concrete and frost. Before he could react, their boots came down, blows aimed at ribs, legs, shoulder. Carl didn't fight back. He didn't raise his voice. He simply tried to breathe. Later, someone would write that he had acted suspiciously, that he had refused to comply, that he had appeared threatening. But Carl had said nothing. He had moved only to perform his duty, and now, sprawled in the snow, with blood warming the ice beneath him, he couldn't even speak. When the paramedics arrived, his pulse was faint, his body unmoving. The officers stood by, arms crossed, watching the medics work. No urgency, no remorse, just the faint hum of the engine, still running, and the wind sliding between buildings like a whisper. no one wanted to hear. The hospital in Hale Brook stood at the edge of town, a low rectangular building with pale walls and a parking lot glazed. In winter, it looked more like a forgotten outpost than a center of healing. Inside, fluorescent lights hummed above faded linoleum floors, and the smell of antiseptic hung heavy in the air. Nurses moved quietly, their footsteps muffled by rubber soles. It was the kind of place where people came not for hope, but for recovery, slow, uncertain, and always tinged with fatigue. Carl Jefferson lay motionless in room 204 on the second floor. The walls were sterile white, scuffed near the floor where beds had scraped over the years. The window, streaked with frost, gave a narrow view of a frozen alley behind the hospital where snow blew in circles like restless ghosts. Inside, the room felt suspended in time. The lights were dimmed to soften the glare, and a heart monitor beeped at irregular intervals, its rhythm as fragile as the man it tracked. Carl's body was a map of violence. His ribs were fractured in 3 places, his left lung bruised, the upper quadrant of his abdomen swollen with internal bleeding. A deep gash ran along his right temple, stitched hastily under the fluorescent glare of the emergency ward. His left eye was swollen shut, purple, black, and angry. His breathing was shallow, labored. He drifted in and out of consciousness, unable to speak, unable to move. The nurses came in pairs. They adjusted his IV, checked his vitals, and sometimes paused just long enough to study his face. There was something in the way he lay, so still, so weathered, that gave them pause. They didn't ask questions. They had seen enough broken bodies to recognize the signs of something unjust. But they said nothing. Their sympathy showed only in the gentleness of their hands and the softness of their movements. No visitors came, no flowers, no cards, no police. Report. The name on the chart read Jefferson Carl, but no one came asking about him. The officers who brought him in had filled out the forms with clinical detachment. Security guard became aggressive. Necessary force applied. A single sentence buried in bureaucratic language. No mention of injuries sustained. No concern about escalation. Just another body dropped off and left to heal in silence. Local news stations said nothing. No breaking alert, no article on their websites. Hale Brook was too small, too insular. People didn't question police reports. They didn't challenge. The uniforms. They accepted silence the way they accepted snow in February, inevitable and unchanging. A man like Carl, black, elderly, invisible, did not stir waves. The city slept on, but silence like snow has weight, and under that weight, something stirred. Word traveled slowly through back channels, encrypted group chats, and carefully worded emails. It started with a former medic from Carl's unit, now a logistics officer in Dayton. He reached out to someone higher, someone with more pull. That man contacted another, and within 48 hours, 3 names surfaced. Morrison, Lane, Hopkins, all. Retired, all generals. All had served alongside Carl Jefferson in a time when bullets made decisions faster than politics. They had seen him drag men out of burning vehicles, hold pressure to arterial wounds in the middle of jungle firefights, and keep teams alive through nights when even hope had abandoned them. Carl never asked for medals. He never gave speeches. He only followed orders and saved lives. General William Morrison arrived first. His presence didn't attract attention. He came in a plain sedan, dressed in a worn coat with a briefcase full of documentation. His hair had thinned to a silver sheen, and he walked with a stiffness that came from parachute landings and fractured knees. He didn't approach the front desk like a civilian. He moved with authority, quiet, unspoken authority, and within minutes had access to Carl's medical file. He didn't flinch as he read the injuries. He only nodded once, slowly, and made a call from a payphone in the hospital lobby. General Richard Lane arrived next, bringing with him an attorney from Columbus. Lane was broader, rougher, with a blunt face and a voice like gravel. He didn't smile. He didn't sit. He walked the hospital perimeter twice before entering, as if assessing security. When he joined Morrison in the hallway outside Carl's room, they didn't speak. They only exchanged a glance and a shared understanding that something had to be done. The last to arrive was General Ann Hopkins. She came from D.C., stepping out of a black government vehicle with a leather satchel and a sharp coat that defied the wind. She brought with her not a legal team but a journalist, young, hungry, and persistent, someone with access to national platforms, someone who knew how to listen, how to investigate, and how to amplify a story others wanted buried. The reporter had no press badge, only a recorder, a quiet resolve, and a long list of contacts. Together, the three generals walked the length of the hospital's second floor. They paused briefly at room 204. Carl was asleep. The machines hummed softly around him, the overhead. Light cast pale shadows on his face, shadows that highlighted every wrinkle, every scar, every line earned in silence. Morrison placed a folder on the chair beside the bed. Lane stood at the foot of the bed, arms crossed, jaw clenched. Hopkins lingered by the window, watching the snow swirl outside. They didn't come with rage. They didn't pound fists on desks or demand apologies. They came with purpose, with history, with connections that reached beyond Halebrook's boundaries. Their actions were quiet but deliberate. Requests for internal documents, inquiries filed through military channels, names forwarded to the Department of Justice. Behind every movement was an unspoken oath. Carl had never asked for protection, but now he would have it. Later that evening, Morrison made a second call. This one went to an old contact in the governor's office. Not a demand, just information. A list of injuries, a copy of the report, the time-stamped footage from the hospital's entrance, where two officers had calmly walked out after leaving an unconscious man behind. Evidence enough to raise questions, questions enough to shake loose attention. Outside, the snow kept falling, thick and soundless. It blanketed the streets, the cars, the rooftops. It coated Halebrook in a quiet that no one disturbed. But beneath that hush, wheels had begun to turn. Files were being pulled. People were being named. A story was being written, not in headlines, not yet, but in whispers passed between those who still believed that silence was not an excuse. In room 204, Carl stirred. His breathing changed, just slightly, as if sensing the shift in the air. He didn't know who had come. He didn't know what had been set in motion, but somewhere in the stillness of that hospital room, a kind of balance had begun to return. Not justice yet, but motion, and sometimes that was enough to break the ice. 3 days after the assault, the quiet town of Halebrook woke to a storm not born from weather, but from headlines. The morning paper carried a front-page article that hadn't existed the day before. National outlets picked up the story, online platforms amplified it. The headline cut through the silence like a blade through frost. Navy SEAL veteran brutally beaten by police in small Ohio town, no charges filed. In the town hall, normally hushed by routine, voices rose behind closed doors, phones rang continuously, and emails pinged with increasing frequency. The mayor's assistant stumbled into the office 20 minutes before her shift, holding her phone with shaking hands. Across the marble lobby, clerks whispered in corners, their screens glowing with articles showing Carl's battered face, his military background, and the growing outrage spreading across the country. The footage surfaced just hours after the article dropped. Previously reported as unavailable due to system error, the security video from the administrative building's outdoor cameras was now intact, crisp, and time-stamped. It showed everything: Carl standing at his post, unmoving, a cruiser pulling in too close to the restricted access gate. A simple, deliberate gesture from Carl. No threat, just instruction. Then, the approach. The officers closing in, the sudden violence, No raised voice, no aggression. Only fists and boots. The footage circulated rapidly, clipped and reposted across platforms. Veterans organizations shared it. Civil rights groups issued statements. By midday, the story had broken through regional borders and entered the national conversation. In response, the three generals, Morrison, Lane, and Hopkins, moved with quiet precision. They filed a civil suit against the town of Halebrook and its police department, citing civil rights violations, use of excessive force, and failure to report and investigate misconduct. The lawsuit named both officers and their supervising officer, along with the police chief, for negligence. Morrison had coordinated with military advocacy groups, bringing with him a list of endorsements from decorated veterans, each one voicing outrage not only for Carl, but for every service member who had returned home, only to be dehumanized by the system they once served. Lane, working with the attorney, filed a formal request for federal oversight into Halebrook's policing practices. Hopkins, operating through media connections, coordinated a press conference set in front of the hospital. The announcement spread quickly. At noon the next day, a podium stood in front of Halebrook Medical Center. A modest crowd gathered, reporters with microphones, a handful of local residents, a growing number of out-of-town observers. But not a single city official appeared. The mayor's office issued a written statement, vague and non-committal. The police department released nothing at all. At the appointed hour, the generals stood beneath a gray sky. They didn't raise their voices. Morrison read a prepared statement. Lane stood silently beside him, arms folded, his expression like stone. Hopkins flanked the opposite side, her eyes on the cameras. The speech wasn't long. It recounted Carl's service record, his conduct at the scene, the medical findings, the surveillance footage. It ended with a warning. Silence would no longer shield misconduct. Carl didn't appear. He remained in his hospital room, unaware of the cameras, the noise, the momentum building outside. But his absence spoke louder than presence. His stillness, captured in those chilling security frames, had already testified for him. By the end of the day, pressure reached the state capitol. The governor, under mounting scrutiny, released a formal statement. It was careful but serious, calling for transparency, vowing an independent review. Then came the unexpected. A direct phone call to General Morrison. Private. Urgent. The words were measured, the promise clear. An internal investigation would begin immediately. The cracks widened. The next morning, the officers involved were placed on administrative leave. The town issued a brief press release, citing pending review. Behind the scenes, the situation was unraveling. One of the two officers, the younger of the pair, began to falter under the weight of inquiry. Facing mounting evidence and the threat of federal charges, he spoke, first to his union, then to the department's internal affairs unit. His statement was damning. He admitted to targeting Carl for disrespect. He described wanting to teach a lesson to the old man with attitude. He referenced race. He referenced assumptions. He claimed his partner just followed through. The confession changed everything. What had begun as suspicion and fragmented outrage became something undeniable. Documents were unsealed, communications reviewed, prior complaints against the officer surfaced, buried, mishandled, dismissed. A pattern emerged. Legal representatives from civil rights organizations filed additional claims. The Department of Justice requested records from Halebrook's law enforcement over the past 5 years. Requests turned into subpoenas. What had started as a local abuse of power became a case study in systemic failure. Within the department, morale collapsed. Officers divided, some defending procedure, others distancing themselves. The police chief avoided public appearances. The mayor's popularity plummeted. Local radio aired call-ins from residents, stunned that the man they had passed every morning at the gate had been a hero they never saw. At the heart of it all remained the footage. Carl, in his coat, standing beneath a dim streetlight, performing his duty without complaint. That still image, his hand raised calmly, the cruiser too close, the approach of shadows, became iconic. It appeared on social media banners, protest posters, even murals painted on city walls in neighboring towns. But within Halebrook, it wasn't anger that spread, it was discomfort. People who once ignored him began to ask questions. Why didn't they see him? Why did no one speak up? Why did it take outsiders to act? The system didn't collapse. It never does. But it shifted. It bent under pressure. It couldn't deflect. The armor cracked, and through those cracks, truth began to pour in. Cold and slow, like the snow drifting endlessly across the Ohio plains, reshaping everything it touched. A month after the snow-covered streets of Halebrook fell silent beneath the weight of truth, Carl Jefferson was discharged from the hospital. He walked out slowly, leaning on a cane provided more for formality than necessity. His gait had changed. He carried the stiffness of mended bones and the deep, residual ache of bruises that went beyond the skin, but he did not limp. He did not look back. The hospital doors slid closed behind him with a hiss, and the cold February wind greeted him as an old friend. He did not return to his post. The old security booth, with its rusted hinges and stained thermos cup, remained empty. The administrative building's front gate, once watched by a man who asked for nothing but vigilance, now opened with automated sensors and a rotating guard schedule. But Carl had never been replaced in spirit. That position had been his alone, and its meaning had shifted long before his absence became permanent. His body had its limits. That was clear now. Years of service, both military and civilian, had taken their toll. The bruises had faded, but the damage lingered, stiffness in his left shoulder, a quiet pain in his ribs that flared with the cold. Still, nothing had touched. His dignity, not the attack, not the silence that followed, not even the hospital bed that confined him for weeks. That part of him remained intact, untouched by time or violence. In City Hall, behind doors usually reserved for budget discussions and zoning permits, a small private ceremony took place. There were no cameras, no public announcements. The governor had insisted on discretion. It wasn't for show. It was for Carl. A short citation was read. A medal, civil valor commendation, was placed in his hand. He did not make a speech. He stood silently as the words faded into the room's still air. Around him, the three generals remained at his side, not clapping, not speaking, just standing. The silence between them was not emptiness. It was history. It was weight. It was respect forged in fire. Outside that room, consequences had taken form. The two officers involved in the assault were dismissed from the force. The younger one received probation, conditioned by his cooperation in the investigation. The older officer lost his badge and the right to ever wear a gun again. But this was not about punishment. It was about recognition. For once, the silence had been broken, and the man who had long stood ignored had been seen, not as a guard, not as an old man, but as a sentinel whose time had never truly passed. As winter softened into spring, a small bronze plaque was mounted near the entrance of the administrative building. No unveiling ceremony, no ribbon, just 4 words beneath his name: for service continued in silence. The letters were simple, etched clean into the metal, positioned just below eye level. Most people walked past it without noticing, but not all. Each morning a few paused. Some tilted their heads to read. A few students placed their hands on the plaque as they entered the building. There were no photos, no social media posts, just private moments of quiet acknowledgement. It became something unspoken between those who passed through that gate, a reminder not of the incident, but of presence, of duty carried out when no one was watching. Carl did not visit the building again. He didn't need to. He had already given it everything he had. On the edge of town, past a curve in the road that led into a narrow thicket of bare-limbed trees, Carl lived in a modest single-story house with chipped paint and a porch that overlooked the forest. It was far enough from the city to feel apart from it, but close enough for him to still be connected to its pulse. There were no neighbors nearby, only wind, rustling branches, and the occasional deer slipping through the trees. Each morning he followed a routine. He opened the kitchen window, letting the fresh air cut through the warmth of the house. He filled the kettle, brewed a fresh pot of coffee, and poured it into the same metal thermos he once carried to work. The thermos was dented and scratched, but he kept it clean. It had become something of a ritual, one that reminded him that vigilance never ends, it only changes form. He read the newspaper slowly, folding it with military precision. He made notes in the margins, kept clippings in a file. Not because he needed them, but because habit was a kind of rhythm he could still trust. He spent hours on the porch, listening, not just to birds or wind, but to the shifting tone of the world. Carl had always known that listening was more powerful than speaking, and so he did. People in Halebrook began to speak of him differently. Stories emerged, not just of the incident, but of moments long before, of children walking home who he had helped cross icy streets, of lost phones returned, of quiet greetings offered with the kind of respect that demanded nothing in return. These stories didn't go viral. They went deeper than that. They settled into memory. The new guards at the administrative building wore standard uniforms and followed protocols, but something in the way they stood had changed. Some of them had read about Carl. Others had only heard whispers. But every single one of them had seen the plaque. And whether they knew it or not, their posture became a little straighter, their attention a little sharper. They walked the perimeter with steadier steps. Carl never referred to himself as a symbol. He didn't dwell on what had happened. He didn't talk about justice or revenge. He believed in duty, in doing what was right when no one applauded, in holding the line quietly, especially when no one else would. In the final week of April, as the trees regained their leaves and sunlight began to linger longer each evening, Carl sat on his porch and watched the horizon. The breeze carried the scent of soil and pine. Birds nested in the beams of his porch roof. He watched with stillness, his cane resting by his side, the thermos warm in his hand. He didn't need to be on post to know the watch continued. Others had picked it up, not because they were told, but because they had seen. Finally, they had seen, and Carl, steady as ever, knew the shift was enough. It had started, quietly, but it would grow. He had passed on the silence, and the silence now would speak.